Picture this, a courtroom filled with judges in long black robes, lawyers arguing back and forth like it's the trial of the century, and a crowd eagerly waiting for the verdict. But the defendant isn't a person, not a thief, not a murderer. It's a bunch of rats. Yeah, you heard me right. Rats, those little critters that scamper around stealing crumbs. This isn't some made-up story. It actually happened in the medieval town of Stelvingen, France, back in 1510, and it's one of the most bizarre, hilarious, and mind-boggling stories in history that I just have to share with you. It's so wild, you'll be like, what were these people even thinking? So let's set the scene. In 1510, the people of Stelvingen were absolutely furious because a swarm of rats had invaded their barley storage. Now, barley back then was a big deal. It was their main food source, kind of like how bread, rice, or pasta is a staple for people around the world today. Imagine if someone broke into your kitchen and ate all your bread, rice, and pasta in one go. You'd be pretty pissed, right? That's exactly how the townspeople felt. These rats were chowing down on their barley like it was an all-you-can-eat buffet, destroying tons of their food supply. The townspeople were so fed up that they decided, these rats need to pay for this. But instead of setting traps or getting a cat, they did something completely insane. They took the rats to court. Yup, they filed a real lawsuit against the rats. They set up a proper trial with judges, lawyers, and even witnesses. Imagine a courtroom that's usually for judging thieves or murderers, but on that day, it's all about rats. It's just too wild. If I were in that courtroom, I'd probably be laughing so hard they'd have to kick me out, LOL. But here's the kicker. The court didn't just mess around with this case. They were dead serious. They even appointed a lawyer to defend the rats. The lawyer's name was Bartholomew Chasanee, and he was one of the best lawyers of his time. And let me tell you, he didn't just show up to laugh at this case. He took it so seriously, he defended those rats like his life depended on it. The townspeople sent out a summons for the rats to appear in court, but obviously, rats don't read mail, so they didn't show up. Chasanee immediately argued, "My clients can't come, it's too dangerous." He said that if the rats tried to travel to the courthouse, they'd have to pass through streets full of dogs and cats. It'd be a death trap. Imagine a lawyer standing in court, dead serious, saying, "The rats can't come because they might get eaten by cats on the way." How hilarious is that? If I were the judge, I'd be trying so hard not to laugh that I'd probably drop my gavel, LOL. And guess what? The court actually agreed with him. They postponed the trial. But Chasanee wasn't done. He went even further, arguing that the rats were scattered all over the town, so sending just one summons wasn't enough. They needed to send a summons to every single rat. And since rats can't read, the court had to send people to read the summons out loud so the rats could hear it. So, the court sent officials to churches around the town to publicly read the summons, like a town crier, but for rats. Imagine some guy standing in a church, reading a court summons to a bunch of rats scurrying around on the floor, completely ignoring him. If I were one of those rats, I'd just keep munching on my barley and think, what's this guy yelling about? I'm busy eating. I'm not going anywhere. In the end, the court kept postponing the trial because the rats never showed up, and the case just dragged on forever with no verdict. The rats got away scot-free, and it became a huge win for Bartholomew Chasanee, who defended them like a champ. But the funniest part? Chasanee didn't just stop there. After this case, he got promoted to one of the top lawyers in the region because people were so impressed with how well he handled it, even though his clients were a bunch of rats. Imagine being the most famous lawyer in town because you defended rats. That's next level, right? If I were Chasanee, I'd be bragging about this to my friends for the rest of my life. Now let's take a step back and think about why people back then would even do something like this. To understand it, we need to dig into the medieval mindset a bit. The Middle Ages were a time full of weird beliefs and superstitions. People back then believed that animals had a sense of responsibility, just like humans. If an animal did something wrong, they thought it should be punished under the law to keep society just and balanced. It's like if your neighbor stole your food, you'd take them to court. So for them, rats eating their barley was the same kind of crime. But it wasn't just rats that got put on trial. Oh no, this was a whole trend in the Middle Ages. Animals of all kinds were dragged into court for the craziest reasons. For example, in France in 1457, a pig was put on trial for murdering a child because it bit a kid and the kid died. The pig was sentenced to be hanged in the town square, in front of everyone. Or in Switzerland in 1474, A chicken was burned at the stake because it was accused of laying the devil's egg, which just meant the egg didn't have a yolk, and the townspeople thought that was witchcraft. Imagine a poor chicken being dragged to a stake and burned, just because its egg was a little weird. How insane is that? If I were that chicken, I'd be like, I just laid an egg, what did I do to deserve this? It gets even weirder. In Germany in the 16th century, a swarm of termites was put on trial for destroying a house. The court sentenced them to be cursed and ordered them to leave the town and live in a forest instead. Imagine a judge in a long robe, standing in court yelling, I curse you termites, leave this town and go to the forest. But the termites just kept eating would like nothing happened. If I were one of those termites, I'd be munching on my wood thinking, curse me all you want, I love this house, I'm not moving. But the animal trials didn't stop there. There are so many crazy cases. In France in 1386, a pig was sentenced to be dressed in human clothes, to humiliate it in front of the townspeople. The pig had stolen food from the market, so the court decided it needed to be publicly shamed. Imagine a pig wearing a shirt and pants, standing in the town square while people laughed at it. How ridiculous is that? If I were that pig, I'd be thinking, I just wanted a snack. Why am I being humiliated like this? LOL. And in Portugal in the 15th century, a goat was put on trial for theft, and it was exiled from the town. The court sent soldiers to catch the goat and release it into the wilderness. If I were that goat, I'd actually be happy, free to roam the forest with all the grass I could eat, instead of dealing with these crazy humans. And this wasn't just a European thing. It happened all over the world. In India in the 17th century, there's a record of an elephant being put on trial because it accidentally trampled someone to death. The elephant was sentenced to work off its crime by hauling logs for the town for 5 years. Imagine an elephant, who's usually just chilling in the jungle, being forced to work construction for 5 years. It's wild. If I were that elephant, I'd be like, I was just walking, why am I a laborer now? And in South America during the Spanish colonial period in the 16th century, a colony of ants was put on trial for eating crops. The court sentenced the ants to be smoked out. They sent people to burn the anthill like it was a military operation, but the enemy was ants. If I were one of those ants, I'd be running for my life thinking, humans are insane, I was just eating leaves. Now, let's dig a bit deeper into why people in the Middle Ages did this. The medieval period was a time full of religious beliefs and superstitions. People back then believed that animals had souls like humans, and sometimes they thought animals were controlled by the devil or evil spirits. If an animal did something unusual, like rats eating too much barley or a chicken laying a yolkless egg, people would think it was the work of the devil. Putting animals on trial was their way of getting rid of evil from the community. It was almost like a religious ritual. But there's another angle to this. Animal trials were also a way for the courts to control fear among the townspeople. The Middle Ages were a tough time. There was famine, diseases like the Black Plague, and constant wars. In Stelvingen in 1510, the townspeople were terrified that if the rats ate all their barley, they'd starve during the winter. Taking the rats to court was a way to make the townspeople feel like, hey, we're handling the problem, even if it seems completely ridiculous to us today. Now, let's think about the rats' perspective for a second. They were just doing what rats do. They were hungry. They didn't mean to ruin anyone's life. Imagine the rats, happily munching on barley, and then suddenly they're being sued, with a lawyer defending them, and they end up getting away with it. It's like a fairy tale. I actually feel a little bad for those rats. They were just trying to survive, but they got dragged into this whole mess. If I were one of those rats, I'd keep eating my barley and think, humans are so weird. I'm just hungry. Why are they making such a big deal out of this? LOL. But on the bright side, this case gives us a hilarious glimpse into history, and it made Bartholomew Chasanee a star, from an ordinary lawyer to one of the top lawyers in the region. If I were in that time and met Chasanee, I'd shake his hand and say, dude, you're amazing. You saved those rats. Now go save some humans too. And I'd probably sneak in a question like, what was it like defending rats in court? If he heard that, he'd probably laugh and say, it's just my job, but those rats? Best clients ever. They never argued with me once. LOL. Now, let's talk about the long-term impact of this case. It shows us how different justice was back then compared to now. In the Middle Ages, animal trials were common well into the 18th century, but they slowly faded away as people started to understand animals better. Science came along, and people realized that animals don't have human-like intentions, they just act on instinct. But these animal trials left a mark on legal history. They show us how people's beliefs in different eras shaped their laws. And if we fast forward to today, imagine if something like this happened now. What if someone sued a pigeon for pooping on their car, and the court had to decide if the pigeon was guilty? It'd be hilarious. Or if someone sued a dog for barking too loud, and the dog had a lawyer arguing, it was barking because it was scared. Everyone in the courtroom would probably be laughing their heads off. But on a more serious note, we do still have animal-related cases today, just in a different way, like lawsuits against companies for animal cruelty, or movements to give certain animals human-like rights. It's like an evolution of how we think about animals, from the Middle Ages to now. Weird fact: animal trials were so common in the Middle Ages that they went on until the 18th century. Besides rats, pigs, chickens, termites, elephants, and ants, there was a case in Basel, Switzerland, in 1471, where a chicken was sentenced as a witch for laying a weird egg, and it was burned along with the egg. And in France in the 14th century, a donkey was put on trial for theft. But it was acquitted because a witness said, "It was just hungry." These stories make me wonder, if animals back then could talk, what would they say about the humans who sued them?